Welcome back to Cartels, Conspiracies, and Camarena. I'm Jack Llewellyn. As always, thank you for joining me. First and foremost, I hope everyone had a very happy, a very joyous, and most importantly, a very safe 4th of July. For my part, I live in a neighborhood that does the 4th of July well, so we had a very good time here. It's happy, joyous, and safe for us, so I hope it was for everybody else. I also want to explain why I've been gone for the last 2 weeks. 2 weeks ago, had a work conference in Boston, and with travel, between the conference and travel, it was hard to do an episode. And then last week and last weekend, I was in San Diego for the American Library Association's annual conference. And while there, I was signing copies of my book, Someone Had to Die, and also talking to librarians and others about Someone Had to Lie, which is the sequel book that is coming out in October. And that whole process gave me a little bit of time to think about where I wanted to go with this podcast, what we were going to do next. And that was entirely appropriate, because this episode also happens to be the 100th episode of Cartels, Conspiracies, and Camarena, which is a number I honestly never thought we would get to. When I started this, the idea that there would be 100 different episodes of the things that we're talking about here really would have seemed outrageous to me. And I'm extremely proud and very pleased that we've gotten this far. And I want to thank absolutely every single person who's been involved and supported me or the podcast in any way. But because this is the 100th episode, because I had a little bit of time to think about things while I was gone, and in particular because I was talking a lot about the Camarena case while I was at the ALA conference in San Diego, I really started to think, where do we want to go next? And the only thing I wanted to talk about, the only thing that made sense to talk about on this 100th episode, was the Camarena case. If you remember, this podcast started principally, if not almost exclusively, to talk about the Camarena case. And it's appropriate now to come back and re-examine the Camarena case and talk about it in a couple of different ways. So I want to do that today and also give you a preview of what's coming up in addition to the next couple of weeks, but also in the next couple of months. Many of you probably have heard this story already, and I'll keep it truncated. But for those of you who haven't, sometimes, actually I shouldn't say sometimes, almost always, if I tell people, yep, I wrote a book, yes, I do a podcast, yes, I do a newsletter, oh, what's it about? It's about Mexican cartels and drug trafficking. Again, I'm a gringo lawyer in Denver, Colorado, or just outside Denver. So the idea that I would be doing podcasts about Mexican cartels seems pretty far-fetched to a lot of people. So the first question almost always is, how did you get into that? And the answer is, I got into it because I was fortunate enough to be at a law firm in the summer of 1990, working as a summer associate, and I was fortunate enough to get selected to work on a case that I knew nothing about at the time. I was just asked to start working on it, and it was the defense of Ruben Zuno Arce to a variety of charges in what would then be known as the first, or later be known as the first Zuno Arce trial, the first Zuno trial. So I, again, was a I was a naive law student. I'd come out of my second year of law school, went to work in Los Angeles, was asked to work on this case, and worked with an amazing group of people as we worked on the defense. And if you'll remember, well, let me back up. I apologize. Some of the people whose names should get mentioned more than maybe I do, but I want to make sure that their names come out. So working on the Zuno trials, my mentor, somebody who guides me in my legal practice every single day, who's no longer with us, unfortunately. But Ed Medvine was the main lawyer on the case, or the lead lawyer on the case. Jim Blancarte, who is now a judge in Los Angeles. I had the personal relationships that brought the case into the law firm. Mary Fulgini was a senior associate a couple of years ahead of me when I started. She worked on the case, was a huge inspiration to me, far more than I think she ever realized. I'm almost certain of that. I looked up to her as a lawyer in ways that are really hard to put into words, and always wanted to try to emulate the dedication and stuff that I saw from her. Ron DiNicola was also on the first trial. Ron is now outside of Erie, Pennsylvania, I believe. Ran for Congress a couple of times, narrowly lost, as I understand it, a couple of times. Wonderful lawyer, great person. It was an amazing team to work with. And I worked that summer on Zuno 1, the Zuno trial. I've told the story that I sat next to Juan Mata Ballesteros in some of the trial proceedings, and as a young man who grew up in western Montana, western Colorado, had gone to Colorado State University and then to the University of Minnesota, I was more intimidated by Mr. Mata Ballesteros than I like to admit, and really kind of overwhelmed by the proceedings, but fell in love with the case. Absolutely loved the research, the investigation, the thought processes. And in particular, we ended up going to Zuno 2, which, again, how fortunate was I? So, as everybody knows, Zuno 1 ended in a guilty verdict for Mr. Zuno. There was a motion for a new trial based on some phrases that had been used by AUSA Medrano in closing arguments. We've talked about those before and want to touch on it again later. But we moved for a new trial. That was granted by Judge Rafiti. The government appealed. There was an appeal taken to the 10th Circuit. A new trial was ordered. As good fortune has it, I was back at the law firm, no longer as a summer associate, this time as a full-fledged associate. And I was able to start working on that case again. And in that case, the investigation, the thought process, again, was something that I absolutely fell in love with. The stakes were bigger than anything I'd ever experienced. The issues were significant. We'll talk about some of those in just a second. And the people that I worked with, again, were unbelievable. I've told the story several times. I don't know how many times or if I have on this podcast, but during the trial, so we had about a 10-day, maybe 2-week trial in Zuno 2 as opposed to a much longer trial in Zuno 1. But in Zuno 2, we were getting information and materials from the government on a rolling basis. So it was very often that we would go to trial, come back, check emails and things. Remember, during this time, we really didn't have external email and things, but we had internal email. We would then meet for dinner and discuss both the case, what had happened that day, as well as what was going to happen next, what we're going to do the next day. And we would talk about strategies and things. And then we would go out and get our work done for the day and come back and start the next day all over. And one of the things that I remember so much is the degree to which we had legitimate disagreements with each other on strategy and thoughts and what was most important, what was going to be best for the case, which avenues of defense were we going to take. And I don't want to give away too much because we're going to talk about some of those in the coming weeks. And there were times when people got unhappy, voices were raised and emotions got high. The beauty of it was, it's what I call the circle and the triangle decision making. So we were all in a circle. Everybody could render a point of view. And as I said, I'm low man on the totem pole by a lot. Ed Medvene was highly experienced. Jim Blancarte, very experienced. Mary Fulginiti had been a lawyer longer than I, had been on this case far longer than I. But everybody had a voice. And we were in that circle. And then at some point, that circle turned into a triangle. And Ed Medvene, as our leader, would say which way we were going to go. And some days you were happy about that. Some days you were unhappy about it. But it produced what I thought was a great work product. And I've talked about it before, but there have been books and others who have looked back at our case and questioned the defense. And some in particular have questioned things that were done in not kind ways. And I take huge exception to those, because I honestly think under the circumstances, if people understood the pressure, the time constraints, the fact that we were getting new information, the fact that we had witnesses that we'd never heard of before, and we're finding about them kind of on a evolving basis. I'm to this day proud of the work that we all did, and I'm proud to have worked with the people that I worked with. At the same time, why is this case so personal for me? It's not just that great experience. It's also Ruben Zuno Arce. The first trial, I had very little contact with Ruben. Second trial, I had more, and there were times when I would go down to the Metropolitan Detention Center in downtown Los Angeles and meet with him to talk about various things. Let me be very clear. We were not friends, okay? If he had a friendly relationship with Mr. Medvene or Mr. Blancarte or Ms. Fulginiti, that would be understandable. I was the newbie on the case. I was a worker bee for all practical purposes. But I got to know him to some extent. And as I've said before in many different places, the Ruben Zuno Arce I met and knew bore absolutely no resemblance to the Ruben Zuno Arce depicted in Narcos Mexico. Bears no resemblance to some of the comments made in other media regarding the case. And more importantly, from everything I know, knew, believed, felt, I did not believe that Ruben Zuno Arce was guilty of the charges brought against him in that courtroom in Los Angeles. I am not going to speak about or opine or even speculate about anything else in his life. Our job as lawyers for Mr. Zuno was to deal with the case presented against him. And for that, to this day, I do not believe the government came even close to proving their case against Mr. Zuno. And I can go to the Last Narc. We're going to talk about the Last Narc in a few minutes. But Manny Medrano saying on the Last Narc, let there be no dispute. The evidence against Mr. Zuno was overwhelming. Bullshit. It wasn't, and it wasn't a fair trial. It wasn't presented properly. And I'll talk about that later, and we'll talk about that in subsequent episodes. The point here is I was part, in many ways, a small part, but I was part of a defense team representing a man who died in federal prison for a crime I don't believe he committed, nor should have been found guilty of. When you do any type of criminal defense work, you will get the question from somebody. I promise every single criminal defense lawyer has had this asked of him. How can you defend guilty people? And my answer is probably not very different from a lot of other answers, but my answer is defending guilty people is easy because you believe in the system. And almost always there's a plea agreement of some kind. There's a resolution. The idea that guilty people get off regularly, I think, is just false. Defending guilty people isn't hard. Defend somebody who's facing life in prison, in a federal prison, for something you don't think they did, or, but more importantly, that you don't think the government has proven. That, my friends, is far more difficult. And that leaves a lasting impression on me and has for many years. Many years. And the number of times I annoyed people and said, one of these days, I'm going to talk about this. I'm going to do something. And then finally, something broke in me and I did it. And it has been extremely rewarding. So that's the personal. That's why, why do I do this podcast? Why do I write the books? Why do I talk to the people I talk to? Why do I spend the time that I spend searching social media for things about cartels? That's the personal reason. Why come back to the Camarena case now? The answer is that there are still so many things that don't quite add up. We can speculate about a number of questions. And some people that I consider very good friends and that I believe in as much as I possibly could, think they have certain answers, and they may be right. But there still are questions that are perplexing to me. What are some of those questions? We've talked about them before. I think we did an episode back where we said the top 10 unanswered questions. But let's just focus on a couple of things as examples. So if we said or if we asked the question, who ordered the kidnapping of Kiki Camarena? Should be a pretty straightforward question, right? Well, let's think about it. I can come up with 3 very plausible answers that some of which I may agree with, some of which I may disagree with, but let's just give 3 easy answers. It could be, or could have been, Rafael Caro-Quintero. It could have been Ernesto Fonseca Carrillo. It could have been somebody in the Mexican government. And when I say government, I'll include military there, much as is kind of depicted in the Last Narc. So you say, wow, that's already 3. Then if somebody said, could it have been somebody else in the cartel who actually instituted? Could it have been Javier Barba, for example? Could Felix Gallardo have been involved? All of a sudden, you've got additional questions, right? Could it have been somebody in the DFS? So we'll separate that from the Mexican government, talking about, more in Mexico City, but maybe it's somebody in DFS, in Guadalajara or in the area. And I think somebody could make a prima facie case for almost all of those. Who ordered or directed that Kiki be killed? At some point, we know that Agent Camarena had been tortured for a period of time and was in declining health, may have been on the precipice of death, but apparently from most of the forensics, there was a fatal blow. Who gave that fatal blow? Who gave an order that there be the fatal blow? Let me ask you the one that has bothered me probably more than anything else. And I've got a couple of friends who I know hear this on a regular basis. Let's go back to the day of the kidnapping. Remember the timeline. About 1:00 in the afternoon, Agents Kirkendall and Bachelier go across the street, directly catty corner from the American consulate was the Camelot Bar and Restaurant. Agents Kirkendall and Bachelier go over to the Camelot to meet with a confidential informant. At some point, they need some money to pay to the confidential informant. They call over to the consulate. Agent Camarena walks across the street by himself, goes into the Camelot. A few minutes later, he returns to the American consulate, walking again across the street, this time with Agent Kirkendall, goes back and starts working. No incidents, nothing that alerted either Agent Kirkendall on the way back or, as far as we know, Agent Camarena walking to or from. At some point, right around 2 p.m., a little bit after 2 p.m., apparently, and I've heard this testimony or observations from people who were there, so I believe it stridently. Sometime shortly after 2:00 in the afternoon, Agent Camarena says something to the effect of, "Oh, heck, I'm late. I'm supposed to meet my wife." They were supposed to meet for lunch at a Chinese restaurant a little bit away. And he gets up, leaves the consulate, walking towards the Camelot restaurant again, where his truck, his blue pickup truck, is parked. And as we know, he never makes it to the restaurant and apparently is kidnapped or abducted off the street at or about the time that he reached his truck. Okay? So that's the timeline. And that's one of the things that we know almost all of that for certain, right? We can pinpoint those times. Let me ask you this. How is it that the abductors, those in the car that abducted Agent Camarena, knew to be outside or on the street, parked outside the American consulate, probably, across the street from or along the street of the Camelot? How did they know to be there at 2:00? How did they know that Agent Camarena would be coming out by himself? There are stories out there by some that they were prepared for a war. If there had been guns involved, if other people had been with Camarena, there may have been a war and they had machine guns and everything else. I don't believe that for half a second, and it doesn't fit with any of the purported witness statements. How did they know to be there at 2:00? And more importantly, go back to every witness statement that we have. Every single one. People who allegedly were either in the car that abducted Agent Camarena were at Lope de Vega before that car left or when the car returned with Agent Camarena, and try to match up the times. Try to match up their description, their timeline with the car being there at 2:00 when Agent Camarena came out, and I tell you, you can't do it. It's not possible. And I could go on and on and on asking some of these questions that are unanswered. We also have, and something else that drives me and fuels me, we all get down at some points, right? And there are plenty of times when I've looked at the microphone, looked at my outline, and said, why am I doing this? And then I think about the prosecution of Ruben Zuno Arce. And I think about Antonio Garate. And I think about Operation Leyenda under Hector Berrellez and working with AUSA Medrano. And I think about the number of witnesses brought to the United States that might have testimony, that might have information about the case. I think about the money that was spent that, as best I know, has never been fully tracked and certainly not disclosed, but was in the hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars. And this is what that prosecution did to Ruben Zuno Arce. They put on a case. In Zuno 1, they put on a case that for the first time ever says the kidnapping, interrogation, and murder of Agent Camarena was a vast conspiracy. The vast conspiracy involving the cartel leaders or the drug leaders in Guadalajara, most notably Rafael Caro Quintero and Ernesto Fonseca, this conspiracy involved government officials, it involved military officials, and it was a grand conspiracy, and that really came from Hector Cervantes, right? Hector Cervantes was the star witness. Forget the fact that he used to work with Garate. Well, that's an aside. But gosh darn it, Cervantes told his story, and he said who was at these meetings, and they were going to prove it. The case went forward, and the jury found for the government, convicted Mr. Zuno, and then Judge Rafiti, as I mentioned earlier, granted the new trial. So new trial comes along. But in between, what happened? Cervantes was totally discredited. Totally. And the wealth of evidence that he's a discredited figure is extreme. It's a high pile of evidence. So Cervantes is totally discredited. Suddenly, magically, the government comes up with a couple of new witnesses. A couple of new witnesses who'd never been mentioned before. Jorge Godoy, Rene Lopez Romero. We've talked about this before, but the timing here is startling. So both of these guys, bad guys in Mexico, right? They were police officers, they were bodyguards for Fonseca, but they were bad guys, bad people. No dispute about that. They come to the United States through Garate, and they start telling a story. They're going to tell all about the conspiracy, but they're going to do it in ways that are very different than Cervantes, right? The stories don't match at all. And their timing of their stories is amazing. If you remember, Lopez Romero and Godoy, separately, but in the same time frame, give initial statements about what they know about the Camarena case. And because they'd worked, both as police and then as bodyguards for Fonseca, they had information that was somewhat relevant. But when they initially talk, they don't say anything bad about Zuno. Not at all. In fact, one of them actually points him out in a photo lineup, says, oh yeah, that's Ruben Zuno. Everybody knows Ruben Zuno. Ninth Circuit says or affirms the new trial order. So Ninth Circuit issues an order that says you're going to have a new trial for Ruben Zuno Arce. And you know what? Within days, both Godoy and Lopez suddenly remembered that Zuno was at all of these meetings. And if you think I'm just making this up, I have documents that prove it. We can walk, if anybody wants, we can walk through it. And we probably will again in one of our episodes. We've done it before. It's in black and white. It's on the government's own documents. So then the government goes to trial. And what happens to Cervantes? Their key witness. He's not there. And all of a sudden, the theory of the case is much different. Zuno now is not somebody who was at a couple of meetings. He's a main player, right? And Lope de Vega was his house. And Lope de Vega was given to Caro Quintero, and it was all part of this nefarious transaction. Forget the fact that there's no evidence to support that. So what do you have? You've got a government, a prosecution, a group of, or maybe one, law enforcement official so hungry for a conviction that they pay money to an untold number of witnesses. They give immunity to an untold number of witnesses. They give citizenship or the right to stay in America to an untold number of witnesses. They convict based on the testimony of one person who is immediately discredited. He, as you know, Cervantes recants his testimony, then he recants his recanting, and then he unrecants that. And Cervantes is a mess, never shows up in the second trial. So then you have the second trial with new witnesses, never mentioned in the first trial, with a whole new theory of the case. And somehow that's supposed to be justice. And it's not. And it's not just a smear on the government itself or the prosecution itself. It's not simply an injustice to Ruben Zuno Arce, who dies in federal prison, but it's an injustice to the legacy of Kiki Camarena himself. From everything we know about Agent Camarena, look at his whole history, his military service, his work in law enforcement before he became a DE agent, his work as a DE agent and then going to Guadalajara, his work in Guadalajara. He believed in justice. He believed in American justice. I didn't know Kiki Camarena, of course. I, of course, have talked to many people who did. But I cannot believe that somebody who believed in American justice the way Kiki Camarena did would in any way condone the way the prosecution was done in those cases. Put aside the fact that you've got people like Mata Ballesteros who were convicted, relating to the Camarena case based on evidence that can't be supported now, right? The hair evidence from FBI agent Malone. And it's not just the legacy of Agent Camarena that's being maligned, being betrayed by both the prosecution and the continuing statements of those involved in it. It's not just his legacy. It's also the legacy of every person who worked with Agent Camarena, the DE agents he worked with, the secretaries he worked with, the local law enforcement that he worked with. It's also every single person who worked to find Agent Camarena when he was abducted. Remember, a number of agents immediately left where they were, went to Guadalajara, people who didn't know Guadalajara at all, FBI agents, DE agents, others who went down to search, to do anything they could to try to find Agent Camarena. The prosecution and the continuing telling of lies about this case does a disservice to them and their legacy. Every good, honest law enforcement official, DEA, FBI, U.S. Attorney's Office, everyone who worked hard to find Agent Camarena's killers, to bring the real killers to justice, it's a slap in their face every time the prosecution and others talk about this case in a way that is not factual. And last, it does a disservice every single time to Agent Camarena's family. As you may remember, I had the great privilege of meeting Kiki Jr. He's a judge in San Diego. Because he's a judge and because there are ethics rules, he can't talk about this case in the way he might otherwise want to. Well, I can. Why else are we going to keep talking about the Camarena case? There are false narratives out there that are believed to be true because some people have had a louder or a bigger microphone. And just because you're louder, just because you happen to get more publicity, doesn't mean you're right. What are a couple of those false narratives? And I deal with this almost weekly. Number one, Kiki Camarena was not involved in the raid on Buffalo. Period. End of sentence. And for all the people on social media, just because there's a picture of Kiki Camarena with marijuana doesn't mean it was Buffalo. And yet, the number of people who talk on a regular basis about Camarena being murdered because he was involved in Buffalo is astounding to me. Number two. We are going to talk about this extensively in the coming weeks. But the perception comes primarily from one source. But the perception that it is a fact that the CIA was involved in Agent Camerona's abduction and interrogation is absolutely false. And yet, I dare say, in the public eye, there's probably more people who believe that narrative than don't. And that says a lot about the CIA and our government and other things, but it's a false narrative, and there's a lot of reasons why it's a false narrative. And even if we do a repeat episode, I'm going to continue to say it's a false narrative, and it impugns the integrity of good people to continue to make it. If somebody wants, I've said this. Remember, I told you once, Agent Berrellez called me, and I've had a couple of conversations with him, none in a long time, thankfully. But you know, the statement was made, well, you don't want the FBI or the CIA, to be involved. And I'm like, of course I do. Or let me say it differently. If I found evidence that I thought proved that the CIA was involved, I'd sit here and tell everybody. If I found something that other people didn't have that could prove it, hell yes, I would go everywhere and show it. But until I find that proof, I'm not going to buy the narrative. We also have Narcos Mexico, and I've talked about this before. Narcos Mexico is an excellent drama. It is an excellent drama. I mean, the production values are good. The writing's good. The acting is excellent. It's enjoyable. But it's a drama. It's a drama based on certain facts. Okay? But it's incredibly important to note that not everything that happens in Narcos Mexico is real. The most obvious example is the confrontation at the Guadalajara airport. And in Narcos Mexico, we have Agent Kirkendall at the Guadalajara airport. He screams about Ruben Zuno or about Caro Quintero. None of that happened. Agent Kirkendall wasn't there. Nobody knew what Caro Quintero looked like before or at the time of that confrontation at the airport. But that's okay. I don't get uptight too much about Narcos Mexico because it's a drama. It purports to be a drama. It doesn't say it's a documentary. It never tells people, believe everything in here. If somebody is watching Narcos Mexico and isn't self-aware enough to understand the difference between drama and fact, That's their issue. I'm not going to worry about that. On the other hand, we had the purported docuseries, The Last Narc. The number of errors, inaccuracies, unsupported statements, factually incorrect statements in The Last Narc, and I'm going to include in that the book of the same title written by Agent Berrellez. But the number of inaccuracies in The Last Narc, in my opinion, is mind-boggling. And it's mind-boggling because it's presented by somebody who either should or does know better. And it relies on the testimony primarily, or the statements of two people, Rene Lopez Romero and Jorge Godoy, who can be discredited completely and easily. We've talked about it over and over on this podcast. We're going to do it some more. We're going to do it in a different form that I'll speak about in just a moment. Godoy, Lopez, and then Ramon Lira is also in there, are liars. They are bad people who saw an opportunity to come to the United States, to be in the United States, and testified and continue to make statements in ways that are not supportable. That is a hill I will die on. I've talked a lot about Hector Berrellez, and I don't really want this to be personal. But I disagree with so much of what he has said, what he's alleged, what he's insinuated. And what amazes me is that there are still people who believe it, that don't want to look at the facts, and that continue to support Hector Berrellez's narrative like it's the gospel itself. In fact, the International Latino Gang Investigators Organization is having a training. All right, I'll call it, it's the 2024 National Gang Conference, August 5 to August 8, 2024 at the Golden Nugget Hotel and Casino in Las Vegas. And if you go and you look at their great roster of criminal or of speakers, they've got people from the LA Police Department, San Bernardino County Sheriff's Office, the FBI, the ATF, U.S. Border Patrol. Looks to be a great conference. Then we get to the last day, Thursday, August 8, 2024, 8 to noon, or to 12:30, excuse me, The Last Narc, Hector Berrellez, DEA administrator, DEA retired. And the false narrative, the incorrect narrative, is going to get repeated to an entire group of law enforcement personnel interested in gangs and preventing gang violence and all the like. But they're going to have, by this schedule, a 4.5-hour opportunity to be brainwashed by Hector Berrellez, brainwashed by The Last Narc, fed a false narrative. And again, I want to repeat this one more time because it's important. I don't want it's not that I have an issue directly with Agent Berrellez. It's what he's purporting to represent. He's representing a narrative that's not factually supported. Remember, too, so we're talking about the Last Narc. I've talked about AUSA Medrano. Remember, in the Last Narc, there's the scene where Medrano talks about Dr. Machine and says Dr. Machine stabbed Agent Camarena in the heart. There's A, absolutely no evidence of that, and B, they couldn't prove it in court, so much so that the case got dismissed at the end of the prosecution. We can go through the Last Narc step by step by step and show things that just aren't correct. Accusations, insinuations that aren't correct. And the fact that we have a group of law enforcement officials holding him up as an expert to talk about these things, it makes me angry and it makes me concerned. So what are the plans going forward for this? February of next year, February of 2025, will mark 40 years since Agent Camarena's abduction and murder. And in anticipation of that, I'm working on a couple of things. So one is, there are a few subjects within the Camarena case that have not been divulged or not widely divulged prior to this point. And I am endeavoring to work on getting all of those out in anticipation of this 40th anniversary. I hate that word in this occasion, but so everything's going to come out. Okay? We're going to present everything. Good, bad, ugly. No holding back. I'm also reevaluating absolutely everything. What does that mean? It means that I'm going back through every single DEA 6 I have talking about the Camarena case. It means that I'm going back through every exhibit, every piece of evidence offered in any of the Camarena criminal trials. It means that I'm rereading the testimony from the 2 Zuno trials, reading them anew. It means that I'm talking to people who've never been talked to or haven't been in years. The idea here is the people involved in the Camarena case when it happened, the people with direct knowledge, precipient witnesses, which Hector Berrellez was not, as we know. The time frame of their lives, these people are getting older. The people who went to Mexico to try and find Agent Camarena, their time is getting narrowed. They deserve answers. And I want to do my ever best, working with some other people. All of that will come out in due course, to present the best case possible at or near the time of the 40th anniversary, to say, here's everything we possibly can say about the Camarena case at this point. That's what I'm going to do. That's what people working with me are going to do. And that's what we're going to talk about, not exclusively, but a lot over the next few weeks and months. We're going to focus on the Camarena case again. We're not going to repeat, okay? Those of you who've listened to episodes in the past where we talk about the case, there's going to be we're going to touch on some of the same points, but there's going to be new information, new ways of looking at things, new questions. We're not going to just regurgitate the past, but we're going to present the case in a new way, and we're going to present it in a way that leads us down a path of being able to answer some of those unanswered questions, or at a minimum, to present a better theory of the case than the government and the prosecution ever presented in the criminal trials, particularly in the Zuno cases. Remember, I want to mention this. Remember, there were 3 criminal trials. There was the first trial, and then there were the last 2 trials with Ruben Zuno. The first trial doesn't talk about a conspiracy at all. It is only with respect to people who had some direct connection. Rene Verdugo was there. He also, had some of his charges dropped because of the hair and fiber analysis of Agent Malone. Okay, sorry, got off on a tangent, but that's where we're going to go. I hope you'll join me. I hope you'll find this interesting, and I really hope that if you're convinced, or I'd like to say when you're convinced that certain narratives are false, the Buffalo narrative, the CIA narrative, the narrative in Hector Berrellez's book that Agent Camarena gave up Captain Zavala, those false narratives, in addition to believing them, to understanding, to accepting them, that you'll also work to get that message out. I don't want the truth to suffer because someone else has a bigger microphone. And you know what would be great? Wouldn't it be great if we could have a debate in Las Vegas? Right? The International Latino Gang Investigators Association, I actually looked at their board of directors list. I know a person on there who I respect tremendously. Wouldn't it be great? You want to have a discussion about facts and evidence? Let's go. All right. That was a bit of a rant today. I apologize if it was, but I've had a lot of time to think about this and to get the clarity of where I wanted to go. So I appreciate the indulgence. Once again, happy 4th of July to everybody. Happy 4th of July, America. I will be back next week talking about something specific on the Camarena case. And I don't want to tip my hat, give a preview at this point, but we will. Did I say tip my hat? Tip my hand. But we will be back next week on Cartels, Conspiracies, and Camarena. Have a great week, and thanks, everyone.